A boy was dragging his little sister through the snow. Then a Hell's Angel saw her bare feet. The snow came down sideways, like the sky itself was angry about something. Tank Morrison leaned into the wind, his big hands steady on the handlebars, his breath fogging up inside his helmet. The road ahead was empty. Just black asphalt turning white, mile after mile, with nothing but his headlight cutting through the dark. It was almost midnight. The toy drive had run long, longer than any of them expected. Rusty had brought his truck full of donated bikes and dolls, and the line of kids waiting to pick one out had stretched around the block. Tank remembered a little girl, maybe 5 years old, hugging a stuffed bear like it was the only thing keeping her warm. He remembered how her mother had cried, quiet tears, when she thanked him. Moments like that were why he kept riding in these charity runs year after year, even when his knees ached from the cold and his back complained about the long hours on the bike. Now the warmth of that night was fading fast, chased away by the wind screaming past his ears. He was 50 miles from home, alone on a county road that most folks with any sense had abandoned hours ago. The snow was falling harder now, thick flakes that stuck to his beard and melted down the collar of his jacket. Before you continue listening, please let me know, where in the world are you watching from today? Now back to the story. Tank thought about his house, waiting for him. Dark windows, a cold kitchen, a refrigerator with nothing in it but a 6-pack of beer and some leftover takeout containers he kept forgetting to throw out. He'd lived there for almost 15 years, ever since the divorce, and it never stopped feeling like a place he was just passing through. No pictures on the walls, no noise except the hum of the furnace kicking on and off. He was 45 years old, built like a linebacker, who'd gone a little soft in the middle but still had plenty of muscle left, with a face that had taken more hits than most boxers see in a lifetime. A jagged scar ran from his left eyebrow down to his cheekbone, a souvenir from a bar fight decades ago that he didn't like to talk about. His club brothers respected him. Feared him a little, maybe, though none of them would admit it. But respect didn't warm up an empty house at midnight. Sometimes, on nights like this, riding alone through the dark, he let himself think about what it might be like to have someone waiting for him. Not a woman necessarily, just someone. A dog even, something alive in that house besides him and his own tired thoughts. He shook his head, like he could shake the thought loose and let it blow away in the wind. Self-pity wasn't something Tank Morrison allowed himself, not for long anyway. He had the club. He had his garage. He had good work with his hands and a life that, if not warm, was at least steady. That had to be enough. The wind picked up, howling across the open fields on either side of the road, and Tank hunched his shoulders against it. His headlight sliced through the snow, illuminating maybe 30 feet of road ahead before the white curtain swallowed everything else. He slowed down a little, more from caution than anything else. Black Ice loved roads like this one. That was when he saw it. Something moving up ahead, right at the edge of his headlight's reach. Small, low to the ground, dragging something behind it that scraped against the snow-covered asphalt. Tank's gut tightened. He eased off the throttle, squinting through his helmet visor, trying to make sense of the shape through the blowing snow. It looked almost like an animal at first, some stray dog maybe, hauling a piece of trash. But animals didn't move like that. Animals didn't have that hunched, determined posture, small shoulders set against the wind like they were fighting something much bigger than the storm. Tank's hands tightened on the handlebars. Something about the shape was wrong. Deeply, terribly wrong. He slowed the bike further, his heart starting to pound against his ribs, and leaned forward, straining his eyes against the snow to see what in God's name was out there on this empty road. In the middle of the night, in a storm like this. Tank brought the bike to a stop, boots hitting the snow to steady it. The engine idled beneath him, a low growl swallowed up by the wind. He didn't cut it off. His eyes were locked on the shape ahead, and now, in the wash of his headlight, it stopped being a shape and became something real. Something that made his stomach drop like a stone in a well. A boy, maybe 10 years old, moving slow and stiff, like every step cost him something. He had on a thin jacket, way too thin for a night like this, and no hat, no gloves. His hands were wrapped around a rope of some kind, or maybe just a torn piece of cloth, and he was pulling it behind him with everything he had. Attached to that rope was a flattened piece of cardboard, the kind you'd find behind a grocery store, soggy and sagging under the weight of what was on top of it. A little girl. Tank's breath caught in his throat. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old. She was curled up small on that cardboard, wearing nothing but a thin nightgown that had gone gray and see-through with the wet snow soaking into it. Her feet stuck out from the bottom of the gown, bare against the white ground. Even from a few yards away, in the dim light, Tank could see they weren't the color feet were supposed to be. They were blue. Blue like bruises, blue like the deep end of a swimming pool. Her lips were the same color, trembling, moving just slightly, though no sound came out. Tank killed the engine. The silence that followed was worse than the noise had been. Just wind now, and the soft crunch of the boy's boots dragging through snow, and somewhere far off an owl calling out into the dark like it didn't know or didn't care what was happening down here on the ground. He swung his leg off the bike and dropped into the snow, sinking almost to his ankles. The cold bit through his jeans immediately, but he barely felt it. His whole body had gone tight, focused, the way it used to get right before a fight, except there was no anger here. Just fear, sharp and sudden, for two kids who had no business being out here at all. "Hey," Tank called out, keeping his voice low, steady, the kind of voice you'd use on a spooked animal. "Hey, hold up." The boy froze. His head snapped toward Tank, eyes wide and wild in the glow of the headlight, and for a second Tank saw pure terror there. The kind that comes from somewhere deep, somewhere that's been hurt before. But underneath the terror was something else. Something fierce. The boy didn't run. He planted his feet instead, right between Tank and the girl on the cardboard sled, and he raised his fists like he actually thought he could do something with them. His arms were shaking, whether from cold or exhaustion or both, Tonk couldn't tell, probably all three. But he held that position anyway, chin jutted out, ready to swing at a man 3 times his size if that's what it took. "I'm not gonna hurt you," Tonk said, holding both hands up, palms out. The universal sign that meant I'm no threat. He took a slow step closer, then another, watching the boy's eyes track every movement. "Your sister. She needs help." Now the boy didn't answer. Just kept those fists up, kept his body square in front of the girl, guarding her the way you'd guard the last thing you had left in the whole world. Tank didn't wait for permission. He dropped to his knees right there in the snow, ignoring the cold soaking through his jeans, and he reached for the zipper of his leather jacket. His fingers were clumsy from the cold, but he got it open, shrugged it off his shoulders fast, and turned to the little girl. Her eyes fluttered open just barely, glassy and unfocused, looking at him like she wasn't sure he was even real. Tank wrapped the jacket around her, tucking it tight around her bare feet first, then up over her shoulders, swallowing her tiny frame in all that warm leather and shearling lining. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice rough. "I got you." Behind him, the boy stood his ground, fists still raised, breathing hard, watching Tank's every move like he was ready to fight to the death if he had to. Tank stayed low, his knees soaking through with cold snow melt, and made himself as small as a 300-pound man could make himself. He didn't want to spook the boy any more than he already had. Fists still up, chest heaving, the kid looked like he hadn't slept in days. Maybe he hadn't. "What's your name, son?" Tank asked, keeping his voice soft, the way he'd talk to a dog that had been kicked one too many times. Nothing, just those eyes, darting between Tank's face and the girl bundled in his jacket. "That's all right," Tank said. "You don't gotta tell me that yet." He nodded toward the girl, whose eyelids had gone heavy again. Her small body curled deeper into the leather like she was trying to disappear into it. "She's real cold. You know that, right? Feet like that, out in weather like this, that's dangerous. That's real dangerous." The boy's jaw tightened. His fists wavered, just slightly, but he brought them back up fast, like he was mad at himself for the weakness. "Where'd you two come from?" Tank tried again. "Where's your folks?" Still nothing. Just breathing, hard and fast, fog puffing out into the cold air. Tank tried a different angle. "You hungry?" "Bet you're hungry." "Been walking a long time, looks like." That got something. A flicker in the boy's eyes, quick as a blink, there and gone. But his mouth stayed shut, pressed into a thin, stubborn line. "Listen," Tank said, and he let some of the gruffness creep back into his voice, not unkind, just honest. "I'm not a cop. I'm not gonna hurt you, and I'm sure as hell not gonna hurt her. But I can't help you if you don't tell me nothing. You gotta give me something here, kid." The boy's chin trembled. For a second, Tank thought he might actually speak. Then his mouth snapped shut again, and he shook his head, hard, like he was shaking off the temptation to trust. "We can't go back," he finally said, voice cracking, barely above a whisper. It was the first thing he'd said, and it came out like it cost him everything to say it. Tank went still. "Back where?" The boy's eyes filled up, glassy and wet, but he blinked hard, refusing to let it fall. "That place," he said. "We can't go back to that place. Ever." "What place?" Tank pressed, gentle as he could manage. But the boy just shook his head again, lips pressed white, arms starting to shake harder now, not just from exhaustion but from something deeper. Something Tank recognized, because he'd felt it once himself, a long time ago. That kind of fear didn't come from nowhere. That kind of fear got put into a kid by somebody who was supposed to protect them instead. "How long you two been walking?" Tank asked, trying another way in. "Since it got dark," the boy said, and this time the words tumbled out like they'd been sitting there, waiting for a small crack to slip through. "Hours. We been walking hours." Tank's stomach turned over. "Hours. In this cold, with bare feet and a nightgown, and a jacket too thin to keep out a spring breeze, let alone a December wind like this one." He looked at the girl again, at her lips still tinged with that awful blue, and he made his decision right then and there, fast and certain, the way he made most decisions that mattered. No cops. Not yet. Not until he knew what they were running from. Okay, Tonk said, standing slow, brushing snow off his knees. He held a hand out, not to the boy, but toward his motorcycle idol and waiting a few feet away. Both of you, get on my bike. Right now, you're gonna freeze to death out here, and I'm not gonna stand around and watch that happen. The boy hesitated, fists finally lowering, confusion flashing across his face like he hadn't expected this. Hadn't expected anyone to actually help. Come on, Tank said again, softer this time, already scooping the girl up into his arms, jacket and all. Let's get you both somewhere warm. The clubhouse sat at the end of a long gravel road, its windows throwing gold light out into the storm like a lighthouse in a sea of white. Tank saw it from a half-mile off, and something in his chest loosened just a little. He gunned the engine harder. Mia held tight against him with one arm, Eli's arms locked around his waist from behind, small hands fisted in the leather of his shirt. He pulled into the lot and killed the engine, the sudden silence loud after the roar of the ride over. Snow kept falling, fat and quiet, catching in Eli's hair as he slid off the bike on shaking legs. Tank didn't wait. He scooped Mia up into his arms, jacket and all, and she barely stirred, her head lolling against his shoulder, breath coming slow and shallow. Too slow. Too shallow. He picked up his pace toward the door. Come on, he said to Eli, not looking back, trusting the boy to follow. Stay close. Eli stumbled through the snow after him, sneakers soaked through, eyes wide as saucers when Tank shouldered open the clubhouse door. Inside, warmth hit like a wall. A dozen men sat around two card tables pushed together, cigarette smoke curling toward the ceiling, poker chips stacked in messy piles. Rusty had a hand of cards fanned out, mid-laugh at something Big Sal had said. The jukebox in the corner was playing some old country song, low and scratchy. Every head turned when the door banged open. Tank? Rusty was already halfway out of his chair, cards forgotten, sliding off the table and scattering onto the floor. What in the hell? She's freezing, Tank said, voice cutting through the room like a blade. No explanation, no preamble, just the facts that mattered. Feet are blue. Get me blankets. Now nobody argued. Nobody asked questions, not yet. The room exploded into motion like Tank had flipped a switch. Big Sal, 300 pounds of tattooed muscle with a beard like a grizzly bear, was on his feet first, chair scraping back so hard it toppled over. He didn't even glance at it. He bolted for the back room where the club kept extra gear, boots pounding against the wood floor. Heaters in the closet by the bar, someone shouted. That was Doc, the club's unofficial medic, already moving that direction, moving fast for a man his age. Rusty grabbed the flannel blanket off the back of the couch, the one that always sat folded there, and shook it out as he crossed the room. Here, put her here, he said, clearing space on the old leather couch closest to the fireplace with one sweep of his arm, sending a bag of chips and a half-empty beer bottle crashing to the floor. Nobody cared. Tank laid Mia down gently. So gently, like she was made of glass, like one wrong move might shatter something in her that couldn't be fixed. Her lips were still tinged blue, her small hands curled up tight against her chest. Rusty draped the flannel blanket over her, tucking it around her bare feet with hands that looked too big and too rough for such a careful job. Get her feet, Doc said, appearing at Tank's elbow, already kneeling. Don't rub 'em hard, just wrap 'em, cover 'em slow. Rubbing too fast can hurt if there's frostbite starting. Big Sal came thundering back with an armful of blankets, more than anyone could possibly need, and dropped to his knees beside the couch, laying them over Mia one after another like he was building a nest. Someone else, a wiry guy named Pete, dragged the space heater out from the closet, cord dragging behind him, and plugged it in near the couch, angling it careful so the warm air blew right toward her. Eli stood frozen just inside the doorway, snow still melting in his hair, eyes darting from one huge tattooed man to the next, like he couldn't decide if he'd wandered into a nightmare or something else entirely. His arms wrapped tight around himself, shivering, forgotten in the sudden storm of activity around his sister. Tank noticed. He always noticed. He crossed the room in 2 steps and put a heavy hand on the boy's shoulder, steering him closer to the fire, closer to the heater's warmth. "She's okay," Tank said low, just for him. They got her. She's okay. On the couch, wrapped in flannel and wool and the collective worry of a dozen rough men who didn't know her name yet, Mia's shivering began, slowly to ease. Mia's color came back slow, like watching a photograph develop. First her lips from blue to pink, then her cheeks from white to a soft pink flush from the heater. Doc kept 2 fingers on her wrist the whole time, counting under his breath, nodding to himself. "She's warming up good," he said finally, sitting back on his heels. "Pulse is steady. She's gonna be okay." Tank let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Big Sal was already rummaging through a duffel bag by the couch, tossing aside a pair of work gloves and an old road map before he came up with a pair of thick wool socks, the kind that went up to your knee. "These'll be too big," he said, sounding almost apologetic, like it was a personal failing. "But they'll keep her feet warm till we find something better." He slid them onto Mia's feet with the same careful hands he'd used to tuck the blankets around her, like he was afraid his own strength might break her if he wasn't careful. Rusty had disappeared into the kitchen and came back a few minutes later with a pot of soup. The good kind, chicken and noodle. The kind that smelled like something a grandmother would make. "Found it in the back of the fridge," he said. "Marge made a batch last week. Should still be good." He poured a small bowl and blew on it himself before setting it in front of Mia, who was sitting up now, wrapped in blankets like a little burrito, watching the room full of giant men with wide, wondering eyes. "It's warm," Rusty told her, gentle as anything. "Try it. Careful. Don't burn your tongue." Mia took the spoon with both hands and sipped. Her whole face changed, softened, like the warmth of the soup was reaching some place deep inside her that had been cold for a long time. Eli sat a few feet away at the long table, wrapped in a flannel shirt 3 sizes too big for him, sleeves rolled up past his elbows. Someone had given him socks, too, and dry sweatpants that bunched up around his ankles. He hadn't said much. He watched everything with careful eyes, like he was waiting for the trick, waiting for the moment all this kindness turned into something else. Pete came back from the storage closet with a cardboard box, dusty, the flaps bent from being handled. "Found the leftovers from the toy drive," he announced, setting it on the table with a thump. "Figured the kids might want first pick before we give the rest to St. Jude's." Inside were toys. Not fancy ones, but good ones. A stuffed rabbit with one ear a little crooked. A set of Matchbox cars. A coloring book with a box of crayons still in the wrapper. A yo-yo. A deck of cards with a picture of a wolf on the back. Mia's eyes lit up at the rabbit. She reached for it with both hands, pulling it close to her chest, burying her face in its soft fur. Eli didn't reach for anything. He just stared at the box like it wasn't real, like it might disappear if he looked away. "Go on," Big Sal said, nudging the box closer to him. "Pick something. There's more where that came from." Eli's hand hovered over the box for a long moment. Then he pulled it back, and his shoulders started to shake. At first, Tank thought he was cold again. Then he saw the tears streaming down the boy's face. Silent at first, then not silent at all, breaking loose all at once like something had finally cracked open inside him. The room went quiet. Rusty and Big Sal exchanged a look and stepped back, giving space, understanding without being told that this wasn't a moment for more hands, more voices. Tank pulled out the chair across from Eli and sat down. He didn't reach for him. He didn't say anything at all. He just sat there, steady, present, letting the boy cry without trying to fix it or rush it or make it smaller than it was. Eli cried for a long time. Big, gasping sobs that shook his whole small frame, months or maybe years of fear finally breaking loose all at once. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The jukebox had gone silent at some point, and the only sound in the room was Eli's crying and the crackle of the fire. Finally, the sobs slowed. Eli wiped his face with the back of his sleeve, sniffling, his breath still hitching. "We can't go back," he whispered, so quiet Tank almost missed it. "We can't ever go back there." "Back where?" Tank asked, keeping his voice soft, careful, like he was talking to something wounded that might bolt. Eli's eyes met his, red-rimmed and exhausted. St. Agnes, the name, hit Tank like a fist to the chest. St. Agnes, for a second, the clubhouse disappeared. The fire, the smell of chicken noodle soup, Rusty and Big Sal standing off to the side, all of it went hazy and far away, and Tank was somewhere else. Somewhere colder. Somewhere 35 years gone. He was 10 years old again, standing in a hallway that smelled like bleach and old wood, holding a garbage bag with everything he owned inside it. He remembered the peeling paint on the walls, the creak of the third stair, the way his stomach used to knot up every time a car pulled into the driveway, because it might be someone come to take him somewhere new, somewhere worse. He remembered Walter Higgins. Younger then. Not frail, not gray. A tall man with kind eyes and rolled-up sleeves who had knelt down to Tank's level on that very first day and said, "You look like a boy who's been let down a lot. I promise you, that's not going to happen here." Tank hadn't believed him. He'd been broken and mean and quick with his fists back then, the kind of kid other homes had already given up on. But Walter hadn't given up. Walter had sat with him through the nights he screamed himself hoarse, had shown up to every school suspension meeting, had told him over and over, "You're not garbage, son. You're just a boy nobody's fought for yet. I'm fighting for you now." Walter Higgins was the reason Tank was alive, the reason he wasn't in a prison somewhere, or dead in a ditch, or worse. Walter had been the first adult who ever kept a promise to him. And now this same place, this same name, had a 6-year-old girl's bare blue feet dragging through the snow because of it. Tank? Rusty's voice pulled him back. Tank realized his hands were clenched into fists on the table, his knuckles white. Eli was watching him with those wary, exhausted eyes, like he was bracing for Tank's face to change, for the kindness to curdle into something else the way it must have so many times before. Tank made himself unclench his hands. made himself breathe. "You're safe," he told Eli, low and steady. "Nobody's taking you back there. Not tonight. Not ever. You hear me?" Eli nodded, but his eyes were still searching Tank's face for the lie. "I mean it," Tank said again. Slowly, some of the tension went out of the boy's shoulders. He picked up his spoon and took a small bite of soup, like maybe, just maybe, he believed it a little. Tank sat there a while longer, long enough to watch Mia fall asleep with the stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin, long enough to see Eli's eyes finally start to droop too, worn out from crying, from cold, from a night that had asked too much of a 10-year-old boy. Big Sal carried Mia to the back room where somebody had made up a bed with 3 quilts. Rusty walked Eli back, one hand resting light on his shoulder, murmuring something that made the boy almost smile. Then, when the room was quiet and the kids were finally asleep, Tank stood up. His legs felt heavy, like they belonged to somebody else. "I need some air," he said to nobody in particular, and walked to the door. Outside, the cold hit him like a slap, but he welcomed it. The snow had stopped falling, and the night was still and silent, the kind of silence that pressed in on a man and made him listen to his own thoughts whether he wanted to or not. Tank stood on the gravel lot, hands shoved in his pockets, staring up at a sky full of hard, cold stars. Walter Higgins, the man who saved him, the same name that boy had whispered like a curse. It didn't make sense. It couldn't be true, not the Walter Tank remembered, not the man who'd sat by his bed and told him he mattered. But somebody had let those children walk out into a blizzard barefoot. Somebody at that home had failed them so badly they'd rather freeze to death in the snow than spend one more night there. Tank's chest ached with 2 things at once, loyalty and rage, pulling in opposite directions until he thought it might tear him in half. He stood there a long time, breath fogging in the cold air, fists clenched at his sides. Whatever was happening at St. Agnes, he needed to see it with his own eyes. He made up his mind right there in the cold and the dark. First thing in the morning, before he told anyone else, before he called anyone, before he did anything at all, he was riding out to St. Agnes himself. When Tank stepped back inside, the warmth of the clubhouse hit him different this time, heavier, like it was asking something of him he wasn't sure he could give. The main room had gone quiet. Most of the guys had turned in or drifted off to the back rooms, leaving just the low crackle of the fire and the hum of an old refrigerator in the kitchen. But on the couch, wrapped in a blanket stitched with the club's patch on the corner, Eli sat wide awake, knees pulled up to his chest, staring at nothing. Tank stopped in the doorway. "Thought you were asleep, kid." Eli's head snapped up, and for a second, something flickered across his face. Fear, maybe, or just the exhaustion of a boy who'd been running on empty for too long. "Can't," he said. His voice was small in a way it hadn't been earlier, when he'd been all fists and fury protecting his sister. Now, with Mia asleep in the other room, there was nobody left for him to be brave for. Tank crossed the room slow, the way he'd approach a spooked animal, and lowered himself into the chair across from the couch. The old wood creaked under his weight. "Talk to me," he said. Eli's jaw tightened. He looked toward the hallway where Mia was sleeping, then back at Tank. "You're gonna call somebody," he said. It wasn't a question. Like a caseworker or the cops or whoever, you're gonna tell them where we are. "Eli, everybody says they won't." The boy's voice cracked, just slightly, and he hated it, Tank could tell, hated that his fear was leaking out where somebody could see it. Everybody says they're gonna help and then the car pulls up, and they put you in it, and you don't get a say. Mia's little. If they split us up, she won't understand. She'll think I left her. Tank sat with that a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling faintly against the windows, but in here it was just the fire and this boy's ragged breathing. "You know what I did tonight?" Tank said finally. "I found you and your sister freezing half to death on the side of the road, and I brought you here instead of the police station." "You know why?" Eli didn't answer, but he was listening now, really listening. "Because I don't trust easy answers," Tank said. "And systems, forms, all that. Sometimes they help. Sometimes they just move kids from one bad place to another and call it done. I've seen it happen." He paused. "I lived it." That got Eli's attention. His eyes narrowed slightly, studying Tank's scarred face like he was trying to read a language he didn't quite know yet. "I'm not gonna call anybody tonight," Tank said. "Not the cops, not a caseworker, nobody. Not until I understand what happened to you and your sister. Not until I know the whole truth. You promise?" Eli's voice was barely above a whisper. Tank held his gaze steady. "I promise you this. Nobody is splitting you and Mia up. Not while I'm breathing. Whatever's going on at that place you ran from, I'm gonna find out. But you two aren't going anywhere without me making sure it's someplace safe. You hear me?" Something in Eli's shoulders finally gave, like a rope that had been pulled taut for hours, suddenly slackening. He didn't say anything else. He just nodded once and let his head sink back against the arm of the couch. Tank didn't move from the chair. He watched as Eli's eyes grew heavy, fighting sleep even now, like some part of him was still standing guard. But the fire was warm, and the blanket was thick, and slowly the boy's breathing evened out into the slow rhythm of real sleep. Mia's voice drifted faintly from the back room, a small murmur, then quiet. Big Sal had left the door cracked so she wouldn't wake up scared in a strange place. After a while, she toddled out on her own, dragging her blanket, and curled up next to her brother on the couch, without a word. Like her body knew where safety was even half asleep. Tank sat there in the chair, watching over them both, the fire casting long shadows across the room. His mind was already turning toward morning, toward St. Agnes, toward Walter Higgins and whatever ugly truth was waiting for him there. But for now, he stayed. He watched the two kids breathe, slow and even, finally safe enough to sleep. He didn't move from that chair until the sun came up. The morning came in gray and quiet, the kind of light that made everything look tired. Tank hadn't slept. Not really. But he felt strangely awake anyway, like his body knew there was work to do and hadn't left room for exhaustion. He found Rusty in the kitchen, already up, pouring coffee into a chipped mug shaped like a skull. Diane was there too, sleeves rolled up, cracking eggs into a bowl big enough to feed the whole club. "Kids still asleep?" Tank asked. "Like rocks," Diane said. "Sal's been sitting outside their door half the night like some kind of overgrown guard dog. Wouldn't budge." Tank almost smiled at that. "Almost, I need you two to watch them today," he said. "Rusty, Diane, just the two of nobody else needs to know where I'm headed." Rusty raised an eyebrow over his coffee. "Where are you headed?" St. Agnes, the kitchen went quiet for a second. Diane's hands stopped moving over the eggs. You sure about that? She asked carefully. Riding in there alone, no plan, no proof of anything? I'm not going in swinging, Tank said. I just need to see Walter. Ask him what the hell happened. Diane studied him a moment, then nodded slow, like she understood there was no talking him out of it. Go on then. We got the kids. Mia already told Sal she wants pancakes, so I hope you're not expecting any of us to get real work done today. Despite everything sitting heavy in his chest, Tank felt something loosen. Just a little, hearing that. Mia was safe. She was asking for pancakes. That was something. He pulled his jacket on, the leather still cold from the night before, and swung a leg over his bike. The engine roared to life beneath him, familiar and steady, and he rode out into the gray morning with his jaw set tight. The drive to St. Agnes took 40 minutes, out past the edge of town where the roads got quieter and the trees thicker. Tonk hadn't been back in over 30 years, not since he was 16 and angry at the whole world, sitting in Walter Higgins's office convinced that no one, especially not some soft-spoken old man with kind eyes, could ever understand a kid like him. But Walter had understood. Walter had seen something in him nobody else bothered to look for. The building came into view through the trees, brick and ivy, looking exactly like Tank remembered, and yet somehow smaller. Everything looked smaller when you'd grown into a man built like a truck. He parked the bike at the front steps and sat there a moment, hands still on the handlebars, steeling himself. He'd come here ready to be angry, ready to grab Walter by the collar if he had to, and demand answers about barefoot children running through snow in the middle of the night. He'd built the whole conversation in his head on the ride over, sharp words, hard truths, maybe even a threat or two if Walter tried to brush it off. He climbed the steps and knocked. It was Miss Carroll who answered, a thin woman with tired eyes Tank vaguely remembered from decades ago, though she looked older now, worn down in a way that made him uneasy before she even said a word. I need to see Walter, Tank said. Now something crossed her face. Hesitation. Maybe fear. But she stepped aside and let him in. She led him down a hallway that smelled like bleach and old carpet past a sitting room where he found Walter. But it wasn't the Walter Tank remembered. The man in the wheelchair by the window was thin, impossibly thin. His skin pale and papery, an oxygen tube looped beneath his nose. His hair, once thick and dark, had gone completely white and thin as cobwebs. His hands, resting in his lap, trembled slightly, and when he looked up at Tank, it took him a long moment to focus, like his eyes were slower than they used to be. Tank? Walter's voice cracked. Is that? My God. Tank Morrison. Tank stood frozen in the doorway, every angry word he'd rehearsed evaporating at the sight of him. Walter, what happened to you? Cancer, Walter said simply, like it was nothing, like it wasn't eating him alive in front of Tank's eyes. Doesn't matter. Tell me why you're here. Something's wrong, I can see it on your face. Tank swallowed hard. Eli, Mia, 2 kids from here. You know them? Walter's brow furrowed, confusion flickering into something sharper. Of course I know them. Sweet little Mia, and her brother so protective of her. Why, his trembling hands gripped the armrests of his wheelchair. Tank, why are you asking me about them like that? They ran, Tank said quietly. Last night. Barefoot in the snow. The color drained from what little was left in Walter's face. Ran? No, that's not possible. Nobody told me anything was wrong. Walter's hand found the wheels of his chair, gripping them like he meant to push himself up out of it, though everyone in the room knew his legs wouldn't carry him anywhere. Nobody told me, he said again, softer this time, like the words hurt coming out. Tank, you have to believe me. I would have known. I would have. He stopped. His shoulders sagged, and for a moment he just breathed, the oxygen tube hissing faintly with each labored pull of air. Sit down, he said finally. Please, let me explain, and then you can decide how angry you want to be at me. Tank pulled a chair close, the wood creaking under his weight, and waited. 8 months ago, Walter began. The doctors told me what was coming. The cancer had spread too far for anything but managing the pain. I tried to keep working, Tank, I did. But some days I couldn't get out of bed, let alone run this place the way it needs to be run. There are 22 children here now. Meals, schooling, medical visits, the state paperwork alone would break a man half my age. His hands trembled worse as he spoke, and he pressed them flat against his knees like that might steady them. I needed help, real help, someone who could take over the daily operations while I focused on what strength I had left for the parts only I could do. The state sent me candidates. Denise Talbot's ARSM was impressive. Experience at 2 other facilities, glowing references, all the right credentials. I interviewed her myself. She seemed sharp, capable, exactly what this place needed. So you hired her, Tank said. I hired her, Walter confirmed, and something like shame crept into his voice. And then I got sicker. The treatments took more out of me than I expected. I started trusting her with more and more. Because I didn't have a choice, Tank, it was either trust her or watch this place fall apart completely. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself once I was stronger, I'd take the reins back. He looked up, and his eyes, clouded as they were, held real anguish. I never imagined children were running from here in the snow. I swear to you, if I'd known, I would have crawled out of this chair myself to stop it. Tank believed him. That was the terrible part. He'd expected to find anger waiting for him in this room, something solid to grab onto and shake. Instead, he found a dying man who'd been too weak to see the rot growing under his own roof. I need to see their records, Tank said. Eli and Mia's files. And I want to walk through the place. See where they've been sleeping. Walter nodded, already reaching for the phone on the table beside him. Carol will take you. She knows this building better than I do these days. Miss Carol led him through the halls without much talking, her steps quick and quiet, like she'd trained herself to move without drawing attention. Tank noticed things as they walked. Small things. Things a man who hadn't spent his whole life reading Rooms for Danger might have missed. A supply closet near the kitchen had a padlock on it, heavy and new-looking, out of place against the old brass doorknobs everywhere else. The coat hooks by the back door held a row of thin jackets, threadbare at the elbows, missing buttons, nothing built to survive a winter like the one outside. In the hallway near the bedrooms, a boy no older than 8 flinched hard when Tank's boots hit a creaky floorboard. Flinched like he expected something to come down on him for the noise. He caught himself a second later, forced his shoulders back down, pretended it hadn't happened. Tank filed it all away without a word, his jaw tight, his mind working faster than his face let on. He could have gone looking for Denise right then. Could have found her office, planted himself in the doorway, and demanded answers the way he'd planned to demand them from Walter. But something told him that wouldn't get him what he needed. A woman sharp enough to fool a dying man and pass state inspections wouldn't crack from a biker raising his voice. She'd lawyer up. She'd deny everything. And the children would pay for it. No. This needed patience, evidence, quiet. By the time Miss Carroll led him back toward the front doors, Tank had already decided he wasn't leaving this to chance. The clubhouse smelled like coffee and bacon grease when Tank pushed through the door, and for a second he just stood there taking it in. Mia sat cross-legged on the pool table, which somebody had covered with a blanket so she wouldn't scratch the felt, and she was surrounded by more crayons than any 6-year-old had a right to own. A biker named Preacher, 6.5 feet of tattoos and beard, was hunched over a coloring book beside her, his tongue poking out of the corner of his mouth in concentration as he tried to stay inside the lines of a cartoon horse. "She said the sky can be purple if I want," Preacher announced when he saw Tank, sounding proud of himself. "So it's purple." Mia giggled and held up her own paper, which was mostly scribbles of orange and green. "Look, Tank, I made a dog. That's a fine-looking dog," Tank said, and meant it. Across the room, Eli sat at the bar with a plate of grilled cheese in front of him, only half eaten. He wasn't laughing like his sister. He was watching Tank the way he'd watched him that first night on the road, careful, measuring, like he hadn't decided yet if the world was safe. Tank pulled up a stool next to him. "You eat?" Eli shrugged. They treating you all right? Rusty giving you a hard time?" "He tried to teach me poker. I won $4 off him." "That sounds about right." Tank almost smiled. He let the quiet sit for a minute, let Eli get used to him being close, before he asked the question he'd been carrying around all day like a stone in his pocket. "Eli, I need you to tell me about last night. Before I found you. What happened?" Eli's hands went still on the plate. "I told you, we couldn't go back." "I know. But I need to know why. Not to get you in trouble. To help you and Mia. I promise you that." The boy's jaw worked like he was chewing on whether to trust him. Around them, the clubhouse noise seemed to fade, Preacher's low rumbling laugh, Mia humming to herself, all of it going soft and far away. "There's a lady," Eli said finally, voice low. "Miss Denise. She runs things now. Mr. Higgins used to, but he's sick, so it's her." "I know who she is," Tank said gently. "Keep going. She's got rules. Real strict ones. About food, about noise, about everything." Eli's hands had started to shake, just a little, and he pressed them flat against his knees the way Walter had earlier that day, like it was something people learned when they'd been scared too many times. Last night at dinner, Mia didn't eat enough. She never eats enough, she's little, her stomach's small. But the rule is you only get what's on your plate, no seconds, no exceptions. Tank kept his voice even, though something cold was building behind his ribs. "So, what'd you do?" "I gave her my roll," Eli whispered. "Under the table, so nobody would see. But Miss Denise saw. And then..." Eli's breath hitched. He looked down at his plate instead of at Tank. "She said stealing food was against the rules. She said I needed to learn a lesson so I wouldn't do it again. She took us to the back door and put us outside, just in our nightclothes. She said we could come back in when we were ready to follow the rules." "How long?" Tank's voice had gone very quiet, very flat. "I don't know." It felt like forever. Mia was crying, and her feet were so cold, and I kept knocking, but nobody answered. Eli's whole body was shaking now, the words tumbling out faster like a dam had broken somewhere inside him. I got scared she'd get too cold and go to sleep and not wake up, so I took the flattened box from the trash and I started pulling her down the road. I remembered the bikes. From the toy drive, a long time ago, I remembered you were the ones with the noise like thunder, and I thought if we could find bikers, real ones, maybe they'd help us. Eli. Tank's hand found the boy's shoulder, steady, heavy, an anchor. Has this happened before? Being locked outside? Eli's eyes finally lifted to meet his, and there was no lie in them, only exhaustion and fear worn thin from carrying it alone for too long. 3 times, he said. This was the 3rd time. Tank sat with that for a moment, feeling something inside his chest go hard and cold and absolutely certain, the way steel gets when it's been through the fire enough times to finally hold its shape. 3 times. Those 2 words echoed in Tank's skull long after Eli had gone quiet. Long after Rusty had gently steered the boy back toward Mia and the crayons and the safety of small, simple things. Tank didn't say much for the rest of that evening. He sat at the bar, drinking coffee he didn't taste, watching the kids until their eyes got heavy, and Diane bundled them off to the back room with extra blankets and a nightlight somebody had dug out of a junk drawer. It was only after the clubhouse had gone quiet, after the kids were asleep, that Tonk pulled out his phone and started making calls. By 9 the next morning, 5 men and 1 woman sat around the scarred wooden table in the clubhouse's back room. Rusty was there, arms crossed, looking like he hadn't slept either. Preacher sat beside him, quiet for once, his big hands folded like a man in church. Diane stood near the coffee pot, arms crossed, sharp-eyed and ready, and next to her sat her husband, Frank, a retired cop with silver hair and a kind of steady gaze that made you believe he'd seen everything and was rarely surprised by any of it. "Tell them what you told me," Tank said to Frank, and leaned back against the wall. Frank set his mug down. "If what that boy said is true, we're not talking about a spanking or a timeout. We're talking about child endangerment. Locking kids outside in freezing temperatures, that's a crime. Plain and simple. But here's the problem." He held up a finger. "We don't have proof. We've got the word of a scared 10-year-old, which matters to me, and it should matter to a judge, but a defense lawyer will eat that alive if it's all we've got. We need something solid. Documentation, witnesses. Ideally, we need to catch her in the act, or find records that show a pattern." "So we go to the cops now," Preacher said, his voice a low rumble. "Let them handle it." "And what happens to the other kids in that house while the cops build a case?" Tank said. "You think Denise doesn't know how to clean up quick if she smells trouble coming? She'll have that place looking like a picture in a magazine within a day. We go in loud, we lose whatever's really happening in there. She'll deny everything, and it'll be Eli's word against hers, and Walter's too sick to fight it properly." The room went quiet. Diane refilled her coffee without needing to, just to have something to do with her hands. "We need eyes inside," Rusty finally said. "Somebody she doesn't suspect." "She won't let a Hell's Angel through the front door," Preacher pointed out, not unkindly. "No," Rusty said, and there was something sharpening in his eyes now, something almost like enjoyment creeping into the grim set of his jaw. "But she might let a donor through the front door. Somebody with money, offering to write St. Agnes a nice fat check if the place checks out. People like her love money. It makes them careless." Tank looked at him. "You clean up decent? I got a suit somewhere. Might smell like mothballs." "You'd have to talk different too," Diane said. "Sound like you went to college instead of prison." I did 2 semesters at a community college, Rusty said, mock offended. I can talk like a man with a checkbook. Give me a day. Frank leaned forward, elbows on the table. A walkthrough gets you eyes on the building, maybe a look at the punishment area if you play it right. But it won't get you proof of a pattern. For that, we need something that watches when we're not there. A camera, Tank said. A camera, Frank agreed. Small one. Hidden, somewhere near wherever she takes kids when she's punishing them. That back door Eli mentioned, or wherever that closet is he described. We get footage of her doing it even once. That's enough to bring in the state. How do we get a camera in there without her noticing? Preacher asked. That, Tank said slowly, depends on finding somebody already inside who's willing to help us. Somebody who already doesn't like what they're seeing. Nobody had an answer to that yet. Not exactly, but the shape of the plan had formed itself in the room like something solid pulling together out of fog. Rusty would go in tomorrow morning as a donor, charming and sharp-eyed, walking the halls with a checkbook and a smile while he mapped the building in his head. Tank would work on getting that camera placed, one way or another, before the week was out. The meeting broke up a little after 10, men filing out to their bikes, the cold morning light catching on chrome and leather. Rusty went looking for that suit. Tank's house had never held anyone but Tank. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that smelled like coffee and motor oil, a living room with a couch and a TV, and not much else. Bare walls, bare everything. He'd lived there 12 years and never once thought to hang a picture. That changed on a Tuesday morning when he stood at the stove trying to remember how eggs worked. "You're burning them," Eli said from the kitchen table, not looking up from the cereal box he was reading for the 3rd time. "I'm not burning them." "They're smoking, Tank." Tank looked down. Smoke was in fact curling up from the pan in thin gray ribbons. He swore under his breath, yanked the pan off the burner, and stared at the blackened mess like it had personally betrayed him. 30 years of riding a bike through blizzards, fixing engines with his eyes closed, and he couldn't manage scrambled eggs. "I can do toast," he muttered. "Can you not burn that too?" "Watch it," Tank said, but there was no heat in it. Eli's mouth twitched, almost a smile, quick and gone. Mia had no such restraint. She sat cross-legged on the living room floor, a box of crayons Diane had sent home with them spread out in a rainbow across the carpet, and a stack of paper Tank didn't remember owning. He was fairly sure it used to be printer paper for the garage's invoices. "Tank," she called. "Your walls are sad. My walls are fine." "They're sad," she said again, like it was simply a fact, like the sky was blue and his walls were sad. "They need pictures." He came around the corner, spatula still in hand, and looked at what she'd already taped up. A crooked yellow sun. A purple dog with too many legs. A house with smoke coming out of the chimney in a spiral, and 4 stick figures standing in front of it, one of them enormous, wearing what might have been a leather jacket drawn in heavy black crayon. "That's you," she said, pointing. "You're the biggest one because you're the strongest." Tank stood there a long moment, spatula dripping egg onto the floor, and didn't trust his voice enough to answer right away. "Can I keep making more?" she asked. "Yeah," he said finally, rougher than he meant to. "Yeah, kid. Make as many as you want." By the time toast was managed, mostly intact, they ate breakfast at the little table, with Mia narrating every crayon she used and why, and Eli watching Tonk with the same careful, measuring look he always had, like he was still deciding whether this was a place that would last. The measuring didn't stop until that evening, when Tank pulled open the garage doors and waved Eli inside. The garage was Tank's real house, more than the house was. Tools hung on pegboard in neat rows. An old Harley sat up on the lift, half taken apart, valve covers off, guts exposed like a patient mid-surgery. "You know anything about engines?" Tank asked. Eli shook his head, arms crossed, standing a careful few feet back, like he expected to be told to stay out. "Come here," Tank said. "Not gonna bite you." Eli came, slow, and Tank crouched by the bike and started talking. Not lecturing, just talking, the way he'd talk to Rusty or Preacher, pointing at parts with a greasy finger. Pistons, valves, how the whole thing breathed, sucking in fuel and air, squeezing it, lighting it, pushing it back out again like a mechanical heart. "Here," Tank said, holding out a wrench. "Loosen that bolt. Righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. Other way for this one, it's reverse thread." Eli took the wrench like it was something fragile, something that might break in his hands, and worked it slow and careful until the bolt gave. "There you go," Tank said. "That's it." Something shifted in Eli's shoulders. He tried another bolt, faster this time, and it came loose easy, and a grin broke across his face, real and sudden and completely unguarded, the kind of grin a kid gets when he does something himself for the first time and it works. "I did it," Eli said. "You did. Can I do the next one?" "Go ahead." Eli laughed then. Actually laughed. A bright, surprised sound like it had been locked up somewhere and just found the door unlocked. Tank felt something in his own chest loosen to match it, some old, rusted bolt of his own finally giving way. They worked another hour like that, bolt by bolt, Tank naming parts and Eli repeating them back, grease creeping up both their hands. The garage lit gold under the hanging bulb while outside the sky went dark, and cold settled over the yard. Rusty showed up at St. Agnes on Thursday morning, wearing a suit that didn't fit him right, and a smile that fit him even worse. He'd borrowed the suit from Diane's husband, and he kept tugging at the collar like it was strangling him, which it probably was. "Mr. Rusty Callahan," he said, sticking out his hand to Denise when she came to greet him at the front desk. "I represent a private foundation. We're looking to make a significant donation to a home that could use it." Denise's whole face changed when she heard the word significant. She smiled wide, the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes, and shook his hand like she was shaking hands with a check. "Well, Mr. Callahan, you've come to the right place. St. Agnes has been serving children in need for over 20 years. "That's so," Rusty said. "Mind if I get a look around? My foundation likes to see where the money's going before we commit." Of course. Denise led him down the hallway, talking the whole time about programs and outcomes and community impact, words that sounded good and meant nothing. Rusty nodded along, playing the part, but his eyes were moving the whole time, cataloging things. The chipped paint in the hallway that didn't match the fresh coat in the lobby. The thin blankets folded on cots in a back room. A pantry with more empty shelves than full ones. He palmed the little camera Tank had given him, no bigger than a shirt button, and while Denise was busy pointing out a bulletin board covered in cheerful crayon drawings, he pressed it into the corner of the ceiling tile above the back door that led out to the yard. It took him 4 seconds. He'd practiced in Tank's garage 20 times the night before. "Beautiful facility," Rusty said when they finished the tour. "I think my foundation will be in touch." Denise practically glowed. We'd be so grateful for any support. I bet you would, Rusty muttered once he was back on the sidewalk, out of earshot, sliding into his truck and pulling off the tie like it was on fire. Meanwhile, Tank had been meeting with Miss Carroll. She was a small woman, maybe 50, with tired eyes and hands that never stopped moving, folding and unfolding a dish towel while she talked. They met at a diner 3 towns over, someplace nobody from St. Agnes would recognize her. I should have said something a year ago, she told Tank, staring into her coffee like the answer was in there. I kept telling myself it wasn't my place, that maybe I was wrong about what I was seeing. You're saying something now, Tank said. That counts. She nodded, but her hands kept moving. Denise keeps 2 sets of books. I've seen it, the one she shows the state and the real one. The real one's on a drive in her office, password protected, but I've watched her type it in enough times. She swallowed. It's her daughter's birthday. Backwards, Tank didn't smile, but something in his chest eased. You remember it? I wrote it down. She slid a folded napkin across the table. I'm scared, Tank. If she finds out I helped you, she'll make sure I never work with kids again. She's got friends at the state office. She won't find out, Tank said. And even if she does, you won't be alone. Not anymore. Carol's eyes filled up, and she pressed the napkin harder into his palm like she was trying to give him her courage along with the password. 3 days later, the footage came in. Tank sat in his kitchen with Rusty and Carol, watching grainy black and white video on a laptop balanced on the table. The timestamp read 6:42 p.m. A boy, couldn't have been older than 8, stood at the back door in a t-shirt, no jacket, banging on the glass. Denise appeared on the inside, looked at him, and turned the deadbolt. She walked away. The boy kept banging. Nobody came. The timestamp ticked forward, minute by minute, while the boy's banging grew weaker, his shoulders curling in against the cold, until he finally sat down on the concrete step and put his head on his knees. Nobody said anything for a long moment. 11 minutes, Rusty finally said, voice tight. She left him out there 11 minutes before a different aide let him in. Carol was crying now, quiet and shaking, and she pulled a flash drive from her purse and set it on the table like it weighed 100 pounds. This is everything. The real books. 2 years of donations that never made it to the kids. Tank picked up the drive, turned it over once in his scarred fingers, and looked at the frozen image still on the laptop screen. The boy on the step, alone in the cold. We've got enough, he said. Walter's office smelled like old books and peppermint candy, the same as it always had. Tank remembered that smell from when he was a boy, sitting in this same room with his knees knocking together, waiting to hear if he'd be sent away again. Now he stood behind Walter's wheelchair instead of in front of his desk, and the weight in his chest was different, but just as heavy. Walter sat with his hands folded on top of the desk, and next to his folded hands sat the laptop. Closed for now, and the flash drive. Small and gray and full of everything. Miss Carroll stood by the window, arms wrapped around herself like she was cold even though the radiator was clanking away in the corner. Denise walked in without knocking, the way she always did, a folder of paperwork tucked under her arm and her heels clicking sharp against the floor. Walter, you said this was urgent. I've got a meeting with the Petersons at 11. They're considering a donation and I really can't. Sit down, Denise, Walter said. Something in his voice made her stop. Walter Higgins was a gentle man, soft-spoken, the kind of man who said please to waiters and thank you to bus drivers. Tank had never heard him use that tone before. It was the tone of a man who had run out of patience for the first time in his life. Denise sat, slow, her eyes flicking between Tank's face and Miss Carroll's, and something behind her polished smile started to crack. Walter opened the laptop and turned it around. The video played. The boy at the door, the t-shirt, the banging, the deadbolt turning. Denise watched her own face on the screen, watched herself walk away and leave a child alone in the cold for 11 minutes, and her jaw tightened. "That's not what it looks like," she said. That boy was being disciplined. He'd been acting out all day. And sometimes children need to understand there are consequences. Consequences, Tank said. It was the first word he'd spoken since she walked in, and it came out low and hard. "He's 8. You don't understand how these children are, Mr. Morrison. You're not trained in behavioral. I understand a locked door and a kid with no jacket in December," Tank said. "I understand that part just fine." Walter reached for the flash drive next, his hands trembling slightly, and slid it across the desk toward her like it was something rotten he didn't want to touch. "Miss Carroll has given us financial records. Denise. 2 sets of books. One for the state, and one real one. I've spent the morning going through it." His voice cracked. Nearly $40,000 in donations over 2 years that never reached this home. New beds that were never bought. Coats that were never bought. Grocery deliveries that were paid for and never arrived. Denise's face went white, then red. "I don't know what she told you, but Carol has always had a grudge against me. She's been trying to get my job since the day I—" "Stop." Walter didn't raise his voice, but the word landed like a slammed door. "I trusted you with this place. I trusted you with these children because I was too sick to do the job myself, and you took that trust and you built a lie on top of it." His eyes were wet now, his hands shaking harder. "I let a child sit in the cold. I let it happen because I wasn't watching closely enough. And that is a shame I will carry for the rest of my life. But you did it on purpose, Denise. You did it. And you smiled at donors the next morning." Denise opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Nothing believable came out. "You're finished here," Walter said. "Effective immediately. Get your things. Miss Carroll will supervise you while you clean out your office. And you will not be alone with a child in this building again. You can't just. This is my career, Walter. I have worked. I can. And I am," Walter said. He picked up the phone on his desk with hands that would not stop shaking and dialed a number he clearly already knew by heart. "This is Walter Higgins, director of St. Agnes Home for Children. I need to report an employee for neglect and embezzlement of donated funds." Denise stood up so fast her chair scraped the floor, but Tank was already moving, already at her elbow, guiding her toward the door with a grip that was gentle but left no room for argument. Out in the hallway, children's voices drifted from the common room. Someone laughing, someone else asking for crayons, ordinary sounds that suddenly felt like a miracle. Miss Carroll walked ahead of them, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, and behind them Walter's voice carried through the office door, steady now, laying out dates and numbers to whoever waited on the other end of the line. Denise didn't say another word as Tank walked her through the lobby and out the front doors into the gray morning light, her heels clicking one final time against the tile before the door swung shut behind her. The word went out from the clubhouse 2 days later, and it went out the way everything important went out among the Hells Angels. Quiet. Fast. and without a single person asking if it was a good idea. It just was. Tank stood in front of the men and women he'd ridden with for 20 years and told them about St. Agnes, about the broken heater in the East Wing, about kids wearing shoes 2 sizes too small because nobody had ever thought to check. And by the time he finished talking, Rusty already had a legal pad out and was writing down who could bring what. "I got a buddy who does vac," Rusty said. "Owes me a favor from way back. I'll call him tonight." Diane didn't even look up from the coffee she was pouring. "I'll handle coats and shoes. Give me sizes by Thursday and I'll have it sorted by the weekend." That was how it went. Nobody made speeches. Nobody asked for credit. They just showed up. By the end of the first week, 3 bikers who used to install furnaces for a living had the East Wing heater running better than it had in 5 years. And the whole building felt different. Warmer. Like it was finally allowed to breathe. Diane organized a shopping trip that turned into something closer to a small parade. A line of bikes rolling into the strip mall parking lot, with saddlebags empty and leaving with them stuffed full of boxes, snow boots and puffy coats, and thick wool socks in every size a growing kid could need. Walter watched it all happen from his wheelchair, parked near the front window most afternoons, and something in his face changed day by day. The gray had started leaving his cheeks. His hands shook less. Tank noticed it before Walter said anything about it himself, the way a man's shoulders come down off his ears once he isn't carrying quite so much anymore. "I forgot what it felt like," Walter said one afternoon, watching a group of bikers haul in a delivery of bunk beds still wrapped in plastic. "To trust the people around me." "You didn't do anything wrong trusting people, Walter," Tank said. "You just trusted the wrong one." Walter didn't answer that, just nodded slow, like he was still working on believing it. With Denise gone and the state notified, a temporary administrator came in twice a week to help with paperwork. But the real work of running St. Agnes fell back onto Walter's shoulders, and he took to it like a man who'd been given his life back. He met with every child personally. He sat in on Miss Carroll's staff meetings instead of leaving her to handle things alone. He started sleeping through the night again, or so he told Tank, no more waking at 3 a.m. with a knot of worry in his stomach he couldn't name. The morning the boots and coats finally arrived all at once, sorted into piles by size on the folding tables Rusty had set up in the yard, felt like Christmas morning even though it was already deep into January. The kids came pouring out the back doors in a wave, breath fogging in the cold, and the yard that had been quiet and gray for months filled up with noise. Real noise. Kids laughing. Kids shouting over who got the red boots. Kids stomping around in new snow boots just to hear the crunch. Tank stood near the fence with his hands in his jacket pockets, watching a girl about Mia's age spin in circles in a coat 3 sizes too big for her on purpose, because she liked how the sleeves flapped when she twirled. A boy near the swings tried on his new boots and immediately ran full speed across the yard just to test them out, laughing the whole way like he'd been given wings instead of shoes. Walter sat by the back door in his wheelchair, a blanket over his knees, and Tank watched the old man's eyes fill up as he took in the whole scene, kids everywhere in bright new coats, warm and loud and safe. Walter didn't try to hide the tears. He just let them fall, wiping at his cheeks with the back of one trembling hand, watching the yard like it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. Tank felt something rise up in his own chest, something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. It sat there warm and solid, right under his ribs, and it took him a moment to recognize what it was. It felt like belonging. Tank's house sat at the end of a gravel road, small and square, with a porch he'd built himself one summer years back, before he had anyone to share it with. Now there were bikes parked crooked in the driveway that belonged to Eli, training wheels long gone, and a pink scooter tipped over in the grass that belonged to Mia. The kitchen smelled like pancakes that morning, and Mia sat at the table with syrup on her chin, swinging her legs under her chair, when the knock came at the door. Tank wiped his hands on a dish towel and opened it to find a woman in a gray coat standing on his porch. A leather folder tucked under one arm, a clipboard peeking out the top. She had the look of someone who spent her whole life reading files instead of faces. Sharp eyes that took in everything at once. The peeling paint on the porch rail, the motorcycle boots lined up by the door, the sound of a kid's cartoon playing from the living room. "Mr. Morrison," she said. "I'm Miss Prentice, from the county. I called yesterday about the home visit." "Right." Tank stepped back to let her in, feeling suddenly aware of every rough edge in the house, the garage calendar on the wall, the stack of motorcycle magazines on the coffee table. "Come on in." She walked through the house slow and careful, writing things down as she went, though her face gave nothing away. Eli came out of his room when he heard the strange voice, and he stood in the hallway with his arms crossed, watching her the way he watched every adult who wasn't Tank, like he was waiting to see what kind of trouble she'd bring. "You must be Eli, Miss," Prentice said, crouching down slightly. "I've read a lot about you." "Good things?" Eli asked, flat, not really a question. "Some good things," she said, and something almost like a smile crossed her face before it disappeared again. Mia wandered in from the kitchen, syrup still on her chin, and held up her hand to show off a drawing she'd made. A lopsided motorcycle with 3 wheels and a stick-figure family standing next to it. "Miss." Prentice admired it politely, said all the right things, but Tank could see her eyes cataloging everything, filing it all away into whatever box the county kept for cases like this. They sat at the kitchen table once the kids went back to their cartoons, and Miss Prentice laid out papers between them, forms with boxes to check, lines for signatures. She talked about the investigation into St. Agnes, still open, still active. Denise's case moving slowly through the system the way these things always did. She talked about protocol and procedure, words that sounded like they belonged in a different world than the one Tank lived in, a world of forms and rules instead of grease and steel and gut instinct. Then she set down her pen and looked at him directly, and something in her posture told Tank the easy part of the conversation was over. "Mr. Morrison, I want to be straightforward with you," she said. "Given that Eli and Mia ran from their previous placement, and given that St. Agnes is under active investigation, the county requires the children be placed in a certified foster facility while everything is resolved. That's standard procedure in cases like this." Tank felt something cold settle low in his stomach. "They're already placed. Here, with me." "You're not a certified foster placement, Ms." Prentice said gently, like she'd said this 100 times before to 100 different faces that all fell the same way his was falling now. "You're unmarried. You have a record from your 20s, and this home hasn't gone through the certification process. I'm sorry. I know that's not what you want to hear. They're safe here." Tank's voice came out rougher than he meant it to, safer than they've been anywhere. "I believe that," she said, and she sounded like she meant it. But I don't make the rules, Mr. Morrison. There's a certified facility 200 miles from here. The children will be transferred there Friday, while the investigation concludes. The kitchen went quiet except for the cartoon laughter drifting in from the living room, bright and small and completely unaware of what had just been decided at the table. That evening, Tank turned off the cartoons himself, which was how Eli knew something was wrong before a single word got said. Tank never turned off the television. He always let Mia watch one more episode, then one more after that. "Sit down for a second," Tank said. "Both of you." Kitchen table. Mia climbed into her chair, still holding the stuffed rabbit Diane had given her, the one with the chewed ear. Eli sat slower, his eyes already narrowing, already reading the room the way he read every room, looking for the exit, looking for the danger. Tank pulled out his own chair and sat down heavy, like the weight of what he had to say was pressing down on his shoulders before he even started. He folded his hands on the table. He'd fixed engines that scared him less than this conversation. "You remember the lady who came by today?" Tank said. "Miss Prentice, the county lady," Eli said. "Flat, right? She told me some things." Tank looked at Mia's small face, at her rabbit, at the syrup stain still faintly on her chin from breakfast that morning, and he made himself keep going even though every part of him wanted to stop. "Because of what happened at St. Agnes, and because you two ran away from there, the county says you gotta stay somewhere else for a while. Somewhere official. Somewhere far from here." Mia blinked at him. "Somewhere else where?" "A place 200 miles away," Tank said. "A foster home the county already checked out. Just until they finish looking into what happened at St. Agnes. But we live here," Mia said, like it was the simplest fact in the whole world, like Tank had gotten something wrong and just needed her to correct him. "This is our house." "I know, baby." Tank's voice cracked on the word baby. Something it had never done before. "I know it is. But I'm not what they call certified yet. It's paperwork. Rules, I gotta get approved first, and that takes time, and they don't want to wait." Mia's face didn't understand any of the words certified or approved or paperwork. All she understood was the shape of what he was saying, and slowly her chin started to tremble, her eyes filling up fast the way a little kid's eyes do, no warning, straight from confusion to tears. "You're sending us away?" she asked. "No." Tank reached for her hand across the table. "No, baby, I'm not sending you anywhere. The county is. I'm fighting it. I already told the lady no, I already told her I don't accept that, but she said Friday, they're coming Friday, and He stopped. There wasn't a good way to finish that sentence. He didn't have the power to stop it. Not yet. And saying that out loud felt like admitting he'd failed them the same way every adult in their lives had failed them before. Mia started crying for real then, big hitching sobs, clutching her rabbit to her chest, and Tank pulled her out of her chair and into his lap without thinking, holding her the way he'd held her that first night in the snow, like his arms alone could keep the whole world from touching her. He looked up at Eli, hoping for something, anything, even anger he could talk through. But Eli's face had gone somewhere else entirely. It wasn't crying. It wasn't yelling. It was still and hard and closed up tight like a door slamming shut brick by brick. Tonk had seen that face before, the very first night, when Eli had planted himself in the snow between Tonk and Mia, fists raised, ready to fight a man 3 times his size. But this was worse. This wasn't a boy ready to fight. This was a boy who'd already decided fighting wouldn't help. who'd already decided the adults always won in the end no matter what they promised. "Eli," Tonk said. "Talk to me." Eli didn't answer. He stood up from the table so slow and quiet it was almost worse than if he'd screamed, and he walked down the hall to his room without a single word, and the door closed behind him. Not a slam, just a quiet click that somehow landed louder than any slam could have. Tank sat there holding Mia while she cried herself down to hiccups and then to sleep, her small body finally going heavy and limp against his chest, and he stayed in that chair a long time after, staring at the hallway, at Eli's closed door, at his own hands that had pulled 2 children out of the snow and now couldn't do one single thing to keep them. Tank didn't sleep. He sat in that kitchen chair until the sky outside the window turned from black to gray, and then he laid Mia down in her bed, pulled the blanket up to her chin, and stood in Eli's doorway just listening to make sure the boy was breathing steady even though the door stayed shut and no words passed between them. By 6 in the morning he was in his truck instead of on his bike, because the roads were still icy and because some part of him needed the heaviness of the truck under him. Something solid. Something that wouldn't slide. Saint. Agnes looked different in the morning light than it had the day Tank first drove up there, furious, ready to tear the place apart with his bare hands. Now there was a fresh coat of paint on the porch railings. Someone had shoveled the walkway clean down to the concrete. A row of new bicycles, courtesy of the club's last toy drive, sat parked by the door like they belonged there, like they'd always belonged there. Miss Carroll met him in the hallway, her face brightening when she saw him, though the brightness faded a little when she read the look on his face. "He's in his office," she said. "He's been asking about you kids. Go on back." Walter Higgins sat behind his old desk, the same desk Tank remembered from 35 years ago, scarred with the same water rings and cigarette burns from a man who used to smoke before his lungs gave him reason to stop. Walter looked stronger than he had in weeks. Color had come back into his cheeks. He was still thin, still using the wheelchair more than he liked to admit, but his eyes were sharp, and when he saw Tank in the doorway, he set down his pen and folded his hands the way he used to when Tank was 10 years old and in trouble for fighting. "You look like a man who didn't sleep," Walter said. "Didn't." Tank dropped into the chair across from the desk, the same chair he used to sit in as a boy, knees jumping, waiting to be told he was being sent somewhere else. It felt smaller now. Everything about this room felt smaller now, except the weight in his chest. He told Walter everything. Miss, Prentice, the Friday deadline. The certified home 200 miles away. Mia's tears. Eli's silence. The door clicking shut like something final. Walter listened without interrupting, the way he always had, letting Tank talk himself all the way down to the bottom of it before he said a word. "You remember why I took you in?" Walter finally asked. "Because nobody else would." "That's not it." Walter leaned forward, elbows on the desk. "I took you in because I saw a boy who'd already decided the world was against him, and I didn't want to prove him right. But that's not the part you need to remember today. You remember what happened after? When the county tried to move you?" Tank shook his head slowly. He'd been 11. Most of it was fog now, anger and fists and a caseworker's clipboard. "They didn't want you here," Walter said. "Said you were too much trouble for a place like this, too many fights, too much history. They had you halfway packed for a facility 3 counties over, a hard place, the kind of place that makes hard men out of scared boys. I fought it. But I couldn't have won alone. Half this town showed up for you, Tank. Teachers who saw you were smarter than your grades. The old mechanic who taught you engines because it was the only thing that calmed you down. Neighbors who barely knew you but knew enough. They stood in that courtroom and told the judge who you really were, underneath all that anger. That's the only reason you're sitting in front of me today instead of somewhere else entirely. Tank sat with that a long moment, feeling something shift loose in his chest, something he hadn't let himself feel in decades. I don't remember any of that. You were 11. You weren't supposed to carry it. I was supposed to carry it, and I did. Walter's eyes didn't waver. Now it's your turn to carry it for those 2 kids. You've got 3 days before that hearing. Don't waste them sitting in a truck feeling sorry for yourself. Go build them a case. Go get every person whose life you've touched to stand up and say who you are. Tank stood, his jaw tight, something hard and determined settling into his shoulders where the exhaustion had been sitting all night. The clubhouse smelled like coffee and bacon grease when Tank walked in, boots heavy on the wood floor. Every head turned. Rusty was first up out of his chair, reading Tank's face like a weather report before a storm. That bad? Rusty asked. Worse, Tonk stood at the head of the long table where the club held its meetings, the same table that had seen decades of decisions, some good, some he still regretted. He didn't sit down. He told them everything, flat and plain, no dressing it up. Miss Prentice, the Friday hearing. The 200 miles between here and where they'd send Eli and Mia if nobody stopped it. He told them about his record, the Dewey from 20 years back, the assault charge from a bar fight before he'd learned better ways to handle his temper. He laid it all out on the table, like cards nobody wanted to see. They're gonna look at that piece of paper, Tonk said, and they're gonna decide, I'm not fit. Doesn't matter what I've done since. Doesn't matter I found those kids freezing in the snow. Paper's paper. Nobody said anything for a second. Then Big Sam, sitting near the window, cracked his knuckles and said, So we give them something better than paper. We give them people. That was all it took. The room came alive like someone had flipped a switch. Diane, who'd been sitting quietly with a notebook on her lap like she'd known this was coming, stood up and started writing names before Tank even finished asking. The Hendersons, she said out loud, mostly to herself. Remember their barn fire 2 winters back? We rebuilt half of it in a weekend. They'll write something. The Millers, Rusty added. Toy Drive got their boy through chemo with a smile on his face. Mrs. Miller cried when she saw that bike we built him. Old Man Dobbins from the hardware store, someone called from the back. Tank fixed his delivery truck for free 3 times last winter. Never charged him a dime. Names kept coming, faster than Diane could write them. A whole town's worth of quiet kindness nobody had ever kept score of, until now, when it mattered more than anything ever had. They split up that afternoon, riding out in every direction, knocking on doors that hadn't seen a Hell's Angel in years, and some that saw them every week. Tank drove to the Hendersons himself, and when Mrs. Henderson opened the door and saw his face, she didn't wait for him to explain. She just said, "Whatever you need, Tank, whatever you need," and went inside to get a pen. Old Man Dobbins cried a little when Rusty explained it, right there behind the hardware store counter, and said he'd stand up in front of the whole county if it meant keeping those kids with a good man. By evening, letters started coming in. Some were typed, careful and formal. Most were handwritten, crooked and honest, full of misspellings and real feeling. A single mother whose car tank had pulled out of a ditch on Christmas Eve wrote 3 pages about how he'd refused to take a single dollar for it. A retired teacher who'd taught tank in the 7th grade wrote about a boy who used to fix broken things because he didn't know how to fix what was broken in himself, and how that boy had grown into a man who fixed things for everybody else now. Back at the clubhouse that night, the whole club gathered around the table again, but this time there was no heaviness in the room. There was purpose. Diane sat at the head of the table with a thick folder in front of her, sorting letters into neat stacks, licking her thumb to turn each page like she was building something sacred. "This is good," she said, tapping the folder. "This is real good, Tank." Big Sam leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, looking proud in a way Tank rarely saw on him. "Judge is gonna open this folder and see 30 years of a man doing right by people who had nobody else." Tank stood at the window, looking out at the dark parking lot lined with bikes, at the men and women who'd spent the whole day riding all over the county for 2 kids who weren't even blood. Something in his chest loosened, just slightly, for the first time since Miss Prentice had said the word Friday. Diane closed the folder, patted it once like it was something alive, and looked up at him. "Get some sleep, Tank," she said. "Tomorrow, we finish this." Tank climbed the stairs slow, the way a man climbs when his legs are strong but his heart isn't sure it wants to get where it's going. The hallway light flickered a little, same as it always had, and he made a note to fix that, then remembered there might not be a later to fix things in. Not if Friday went the way Miss Prentice wanted it to go. Eli's door was cracked open an inch. Tank knocked anyway, soft, with one knuckle. No answer. He pushed it open and found the boy sitting on the edge of his bed, still in his day clothes, knees pulled up to his chest, staring at the wall like it owed him something. The lamp was off. Only the streetlight coming through the window gave the room any color at all, painting everything a pale, sad blue. "Hey, bud," Tank said. He kept his voice low, careful, the way you'd talk to a bird that might fly off if you moved too fast. Eli didn't turn his head. Tank came in anyway and sat down on the little wooden chair by the desk, the one Eli used for homework, the one Tank had sanded down himself so the boy wouldn't get a splinter. The chair creaked under his weight. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window in its frame. "I know you heard everything," Tank said. "About Friday. About the judge." Still nothing. Eli's jaw was tight, his eyes fixed on some spot on the wall that wasn't really there, that was just a place to put his eyes so he didn't have to look at anything real. "I know you're scared," Tank said. "I know you don't want to talk about it. That's okay. You don't have to talk. I didn't want you sitting up here alone tonight. That's all." The clock on the desk ticked. Somewhere downstairs, Mia's nightlight hummed against the dark, a small song of comfort that didn't reach up the stairs to where her brother sat, frozen solid in a way that had nothing to do with the cold outside. Tank stayed. He didn't fill the silence with more words, because he'd learned by now that Eli's silence wasn't empty. It was full, packed tight with things too heavy for a 10-year-old to carry, and yelling into it or begging it to open up never did a lick of good. So Tank just sat there, hands folded between his knees, letting the quiet stretch out long and thin between them like a rope neither one wanted to be the first to let go of. Minutes passed, maybe 10, maybe more. Tank didn't check. Then, so soft he almost missed it under the sound of the wind, Eli spoke. "Are we really gonna lose you?" Tank's chest tightened like a fist had closed around it. He looked up, and for the first time since he'd walked in, Eli was looking back at him. Eyes wet and wide and scared in a way that broke something loose in Tank that he'd kept locked down tight for 35 years. "No," Tank said, and his voice cracked right down the middle of the word, splitting it open. "Nobody. I am not gonna let that happen." He got up from the chair and crossed the small distance between them, kneeling down so he was eye level with the boy, the way he used to kneel in the snow that first night, wrapping a coat around a little girl who couldn't feel her own feet anymore. "I got the whole club standing up for me tomorrow," Tank said. "Whole town, near enough, people I helped. People who know me. People who are gonna stand in front of that judge and tell her who I really am. I am gonna fight for you and your sister with everything I got. Every last thing. You hear me?" Eli looked at him a long moment, something flickering behind his eyes that Tank couldn't quite read. Hope, maybe, or the ghost of hope, worn thin from being disappointed too many times before by adults who'd made promises just like this one. Then, without a word, the boy turned his face back to the wall, pulling his knees tighter to his chest, shutting the door on the conversation as surely as if he'd said goodnight and meant it. Tank knelt there a moment longer in the blue dark, his promise still hanging in the air between them, unanswered. The courtroom smelled like old wood and coffee, and it was packed tighter than Tank had ever seen it. He stood near the front, wearing the only suit he owned, the collar too tight around his thick neck. Behind him, filling row after row of hard wooden benches, sat his club. Leather jackets and patches everywhere you looked. Big men with beards and tattoos sitting shoulder to shoulder with women in flower dresses and old men in their best church clothes. Diane sat near the aisle, a folder of papers in her lap, her mouth set in a firm, determined line. Rusty sat behind Tank, arms crossed, jaw tight. It looked wrong, all these leather vests next to Sunday suits. And somehow, it looked exactly right. Eli sat beside Tank in the front row, his small hands folded tight in his lap. Mia sat on his other side, swinging her feet, too young to understand the weight of the room, but old enough to feel it in the way everyone was quiet. She held Tank's finger with her whole fist. The judge, a stern-faced woman named Judge Alvarez, banged her gavel once. The sound cracked through the room like a rifle shot, and everyone settled. "We are here for the emergency custody hearing regarding the minors Eli and Mia Carter," she said, reading from a paper in front of her. "Miss Prentice, you may proceed with the state's position." Miss Prentice stood. She was a tall woman, sharp-suited, with a folder just as thick as Diane's. She didn't look unkind, just careful, the way people get when rules have been their whole life. "Your Honor," she said, "the state does not dispute Mr. Morrison's actions on the night in question. He may well have saved these children's lives. But procedure exists for a reason. Mr. Morrison has a criminal record from his youth. He is unmarried, lives alone, and has no prior experience as a certified foster parent. The state's position is that these children should be placed in a certified facility while the investigation into St. Agnes concludes, per standard protocol." She sat down. The words landed heavy in the room, and Tank felt Eli go rigid beside him. Judge Alvarez nodded slowly, noted, "Does the defense wish to call a witness?" Diane leaned forward and whispered something to the lawyer Tank had hired, a quiet, capable man named Mr. Doyle who'd taken the case for barely more than the cost of a used engine. Doyle stood. "Your Honor, we'd like to call Walter Higgins to the stand." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Heads turned toward the back, where Walter sat in his wheelchair, a blanket over his knees despite the warmth of the room. Miss Carroll stood beside him, her hand resting gently on the wheelchair's handle. Slowly, carefully, she pushed him up the aisle. The wheels squeaked against the tile floor, the only sound in a room gone completely silent. Walter's face was thin and pale, his hands trembling slightly in his lap, but his eyes were clear and steady. They wheeled him to the front, and Doyle helped him settle near the witness stand, since standing wasn't something Walter could manage anymore. "Mr. Higgins," Doyle said gently, "can you tell the court how you know Tank Morrison?" Walter took a breath. It rattled a little in his chest, but when he spoke, his voice was strong enough to carry. 35 years ago, he said, a boy came to St. Agnes, angry, scared, nobody wanted him. He'd been passed around so many homes, he'd stopped believing anybody ever would. Walter paused, his eyes finding Tank's across the room. "I saw something in him nobody else did. I fought the system back then, too, to keep him from being shipped off somewhere worse. Everybody told me I was a fool for believing in a boy like that." His voice cracked. Miss Carroll placed a hand on his shoulder. "That boy," Walter went on, tears sliding freely down his weathered face now, grew into a man who found 2 children freezing in the snow and gave them his own coat off his back, who has spent the last few months teaching them what it means to be safe. I was right to believe in him then. And I am telling this court, with everything I have left in me, that I am right to believe in him now." The room was silent, except for the sound of someone in the back row quietly crying. Diane wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Even Rusty, tough as old boot leather, blinked hard and looked at the ceiling. Judge Alvarez sat still for a long moment, studying Walter's face, then Tank's, then the 2 children sitting so close together in the front row. "This court will take a short recess," she said finally, "to consider what has been presented." She banged the gavel once more, and the room exhaled all at once, like it had been holding its breath the whole time. The recess didn't last long. People shifted in their seats, whispering low, and Tank kept his eyes on the judge's empty chair like she might walk back in any second and end everything with one more bang of her gavel. That was when Eli stood up. He didn't ask Tank first. He didn't ask Diane or Mr. Doyle either. He just stood, small and stiff in his borrowed collared shirt, his chin trembling but his shoulders square. "Excuse me," he said, and his voice came out thinner than he wanted it to. He cleared his throat and tried again, louder this time. "Excuse me, can I say something? Please?" Judge Alvarez had just walked back in, her robe swishing around her ankles. She stopped halfway to her chair and looked at the boy standing in the front row, his sister staring up at him with wide eyes. "This is a courtroom, young man, not usually a place for children to testify," she said. But she paused. Something in Eli's face must have caught her, because she didn't sit down right away. "But I suppose we can make an exception. Come forward." Tank's heart pounded so hard he thought the whole room could hear it. He didn't know what Eli was about to do. Eli hadn't told him a plan. Eli hadn't told him anything. The boy walked to the front, past Mr. Doyle, past Miss Prentice, and stood facing the judge. His hands were shaking, but he shoved them into his pockets to hide it. That night Eli started, the night in the snow. "Everybody keeps saying Tank found us. Like it was luck. Like he was just riding by and there we were. He shook his head. That's not what happened. The courtroom had gone quiet again, quieter than before. When we ran from St. Agnes, I didn't just run anywhere, Eli said. I knew where I was going. Sort of. I remembered something from when I was little. There was a toy drive years back before things got bad there. Bikers came, big loud motorcycles, and they brought toys for all of us, even kids nobody else brought anything for. His voice wobbled, but he pushed through it. I remember thinking, these guys look scary, but they're not scary. They gave us stuff and didn't ask for nothing back. My teacher told me once that some people are guardians, like angels, except real. And I remember thinking, maybe bikers are the real ones. Not made up. Real, Mia had turned all the way around in her seat to watch her brother, her small hand pressed over her mouth. So when we ran, Eli went on, I dragged Mia toward the road where I used to hear motorcycles at night. I didn't know if anybody would be there. I didn't know if it would work. But I kept telling her, just a little further, just a little further. Because I believed it. I believed if we could find that sound again, somebody would help us. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, fast and embarrassed. So it wasn't luck that Tank found us. I was looking for him. Maybe not him exactly, but somebody like him. I'd been hoping for somebody like him since I was little, since that toy drive, and I never stopped hoping, not even when things got really bad. His voice cracked apart completely now, tears running down his face without him even trying to stop them. He's not just some guy who happened to be riding by, Eli said, looking straight at Judge Alvarez. He's the guy I was looking for years, and I found him. Please don't send us somewhere else. Please. He stopped talking. There was nothing left to say, and it showed on his face, raw and open and completely undone. The courtroom stayed silent. Nobody moved. Diane had both hands pressed over her mouth. Rusty stared down at his boots, jaw working hard like he was trying not to fall apart in front of everybody. Miss Carroll was openly crying into a tissue, and Walter sat with his eyes closed, his lips moving in something that might have been a prayer. Even Miss Prentice, careful and rule-bound Miss Prentice, had her pen frozen halfway across her legal pad, her eyes shining. Judge Alvarez said nothing for a long moment. She simply looked at the boy standing in front of her, small and trembling and completely certain, and her stern face had softened into something else entirely. Judge Alvarez finally spoke. "Young man, you can sit back down now. Thank you." Eli nodded and walked back to his seat, but his legs looked wobbly, like they might give out. Tank half rose to help him, but Diane got there first, guiding him down and wrapping an arm around his shoulders. Mia grabbed his hand the second he sat and did not let go. The judge did not sit down herself. She stood behind her chair, one hand resting on the back of it, looking out at the courtroom like she was seeing all of it fresh. Her eyes moved over the rows of leather vests and patches, over Walter in his wheelchair, over Miss Carroll still dabbing her eyes, over Miss Prentice with her frozen pen. "I have sat on this bench for 11 years, she said slowly. "I have seen a lot of cases come through here. Custody fights, placement disputes. I have learned to be careful, because the rules exist for a reason. Children get hurt when adults skip steps. Children get hurt when the system moves too fast." She paused, and the courtroom held its breath along with her. "But I have also learned that rules without eyes are just paper," she went on. "And today I have used my eyes." I watched a room full of grown men, Men the law has taught me to be suspicious of because of patches on their jackets. Stand up one after another and describe years of quiet kindness. Toy drives. Roadside help for strangers. A man who fixes bikes for free when someone can't pay. None of that is required by any law I know of. They did it because it was right. She looked at Walter next. I heard a sick man, a man who built his whole life around caring for children nobody else wanted. Tell me that the same boy he once saved from the system 35 years ago grew up to be exactly the kind of guardian this system is supposed to produce, and so rarely does. Then her eyes found Eli, still gripping Mia's hand like it was the only solid thing left in the world. And I heard a 10-year-old boy tell me that he chose this family, that he ran toward the sound of motorcycles in the middle of a snowstorm because some part of him, even after everything that had been done to him, still believed that good people existed and that he could find them. Her voice caught, just slightly, before she steadied it. I am not going to pretend that doesn't move me. I would be lying to myself and to this court if I said it didn't. She looked down at the papers in front of her, then back up. The formal foster certification process exists for good reasons, and Mr. Morrison will still need to complete it. That is not optional, and I expect full cooperation on all sides. Her gaze flicked briefly to Miss Prentice, who nodded. But I see no reason. None. Why these children should be shipped across the state to strangers while paperwork catches up to what is already true in every way that matters. She picked up her gavel, and the sound of it against the wood cracked through the courtroom like a starting gun. This court grants emergency guardianship of Eli and Mia to Tank Morrison, effective immediately, pending completion of formal foster certification. The children will remain in his care. For half a second, nobody moved, like the words hadn't landed yet. Then the courtroom broke open all at once. Diane let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. Rusty pumped his fist and immediately looked embarrassed about it, but nobody cared. Miss Carroll pressed both hands to her face. Walter closed his eyes, tears sliding freely down his cheeks, his lips moving again, this time clearly saying, "Thank you, thank you, thank you." Eli sat frozen for one long second, like his brain hadn't caught up to his heart. Then, he was up, out of his seat, moving fast across the space between him and Tank, and he threw both arms around Tank's middle, burying his face against him and holding on with everything he had, shaking, finally letting himself cry without trying to hide it or stop it. Tank froze too, just for a moment, his big arms hovering like he didn't quite believe this was real. Then he wrapped them around the boy, holding him steady, holding him close, his scarred face crumpling as he pressed his cheek against the top of Eli's head. Mia scrambled off her chair and wrapped herself around both their legs, laughing and crying at the same time, and the whole courtroom rose to its feet in a wave of quiet, overwhelming joy. Spring came to the little town slow and easy, the way it always did, melting the snow in patches until the ground showed through, dark and soft and ready for new things to grow. The trees along Tank's street had started budding out in small green fists. The air smelled like wet earth and possibility. At St. Agnes, the change was even bigger. The old paint had been scraped off and replaced with a warm yellow that Walter picked out himself, sitting in his wheelchair on the lawn, pointing at color swatches with a shaking finger and grinning like a kid. New bunk beds had arrived, sturdy ones, donated in part by a mysterious group of motorcycle riders who showed up one Saturday with a truck full of furniture and refused to say who sent them. Miss Carroll had been promoted to run daily operations, and she moved through the halls now with her shoulders back, no longer flinching at footsteps behind her. The children at St. Agnes had shoes that fit, and beds that were warm, and adults who checked on them because they wanted to, not because a camera was watching. Walter still tired easily. His illness hadn't vanished, but something in him had steadied, like a man who'd found his reason to keep going. He liked to say that watching Tank raise those two kids was better medicine than anything a doctor could give him. The certification letter came on a Tuesday, tucked between a phone bill and a flyer for a hardware store sale. Tank almost missed it. He was halfway through making sandwiches for Eli's lunch when he saw the return address, and his hands went still. "Eli," he called out, voice rougher than usual. "Come here a second." Eli came in from the living room, Mia trailing behind him with a crayon still in her hand, and watched Tank tear open the envelope with fingers that weren't quite steady. Tank read it twice before he trusted it enough to speak. "It's official," he said. "Foster certification." "Approved," Eli grinned, the wide, easy grin he'd learned to wear again over the past months. And Mia, not fully understanding but catching the joy in the room anyway, threw her arms up and yelled, "Yay." Just because everyone else looked happy. It landed the same week as Mia's 7th birthday, which the club had been talking about for a month straight, arguing over cake flavors and party favors like it was a matter of national importance. Saturday came bright and clear, and the clubhouse had been transformed. Streamers, pink and purple, were tied along the handlebars of every parked motorcycle out front, fluttering in the breeze like something out of a cartoon. Balloons bobbed from the porch railing. Someone had strung up a banner that said "Happy Birthday MIA" in slightly crooked letters, clearly hand-painted by men who were far more comfortable with wrenches than paintbrushes. Inside, the transformation was even stranger and more wonderful. A dozen grown men, tattooed arms and scarred knuckles and all, were down on their knees on the clubhouse floor, playing dolls with a delighted 6-year-old. Rusty had a plastic princess in one enormous hand, doing a squeaky voice that made Mia shriek with laughter. Another biker, a mountain of a man named Bear, was gently brushing a doll's hair with the kind of careful concentration he usually reserved for engine parts. Tank stood near the doorway for a moment, just watching. His chest felt full, too full, like it might not hold everything inside it. Diane came up beside him, handing him a paper cup of lemonade. "Look at that," she said, nodding toward the room. "Rolling family reunion." "Yeah," Tank said. "Guess it is." Later that afternoon, with the party still going strong behind them, Tank wheeled his bike out into the sunlight, the sidecar freshly cleaned and ready. Mia climbed in, swallowed up in a Hell's Angels jacket 3 sizes too big for her, sleeves rolled up in thick cuffs, grinning ear to ear. Eli swung a leg over his own small bike, one Tank had built for him piece by piece over the winter, engine humming steady and proud beneath him. Tank kicked his bike to life, the sound rolling out low and warm into the spring air. "Ready?" He called back. "Ready." Mia shouted, laughing as the wind caught her hair. Behind them, one by one, the club fired up their engines until the whole street rumbled with sound, and they rode off together down the sunlit road, home at last. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.